Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Seth Feeman. I serve as Executive Director and CEO here at the Frist Art Museum. Thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to see you with us today. As is our custom at the Frist, I'd like to first offer a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum sits on land the Cherokee and Shawnee Native peoples, elders, and their ancestors call their homeland. We acknowledge and pay respect to them and offer deep gratitude and respect to the land and water that support us. Today, we are excited to open the exhibition M. Florine Démosthène and Didier William, What the Body Carries, on view in our Gordon Cap Gallery through May 4th. We're very grateful to have both artists here with us today to talk about their work with the exhibition curator, Senior Curator Katie Delmez. Katie will introduce both of the artists in just a moment, though I hope many of you are already familiar with the artists. Both of them were featured in our 2023 exhibition, Multiplicity, Blackness in Contemporary American Collage, which is where Katie first started thinking about the opportunity to bring their work together for a more substantive exploration. And I'm glad they agreed to do it. Before I turn it over to Katie to make formal introductions, I want to acknowledge a few folks who helped make the project possible. When you visit the exhibition, you'll find an interactive timeline highlighting important moments in Haitian history, and I'm grateful to Professor Jesus Ruiz, the Assistant Professor of Caribbean Studies at Vanderbilt, who served as a reader of the material and helped put that together. We're happy to share that also select interpretive texts are available in the galleries and online in Haitian Creole, thanks to translations provided by Marlene Julien at Creole Solutions. This also includes a really beautiful essay written by Grace Ali, a Guyanese curator, writer, and professor who is also the current curator of, that's a tongue twister, current curator of the Engine for Art, Democracy, and Justice, which is an initiative at Vanderbilt University where she's focusing on art and immigration this year. There will be several related programs at Vanderbilt this spring, including the inaugural Caribbean Week, March 24th through 29th, and an exhibition of Haitian American photographer Vanessa Charlot at Begonia Labs. We're also joined today by a lender of Didier's work, Wally Bakare, Becky Koblik, the director of Altman Siegel Gallery and a lender to the show, and Iriola Olife, Florine studio director. Thank you for being here and for your grace. What the Body Carries is supported in part by Clay Blevins and the Gordon Cap Gallery Fund, and we're grateful for the continuing operating support from the Frist Foundation, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Now, please silence your cell phones. I'm looking at all of you. Please silence your cell phones. And also take note of where the emergency exits are. And then please join me in welcoming Katie, Florine, and Didier to the stage.
Is on? We're on? Great, okay. Well, thank you, Seth, and thank you all for being here. I'm so delighted you're here to join us for what I know will be a really illuminating conversation between two artists, two really wonderful people whose stars are really shining bright and on the rise. We're very lucky to have you both here. Before we get started, though, I'd love to very briefly share some biographical information on each artist. M. Florine Démosthène was born in New York, but raised primarily in Haiti by extended family members, which I've learned was common for Haitian immigrant parents to do at the time. After receiving a degree in architecture, she returned to school for a BFA at Parsons School of Design and an MFA from Hunter College. Démosthène has been awarded numerous prestigious grants, including a Joan Mitchell Foundation grant, an Arts Moves Africa grant, and a Black Star Award. And she's held residencies in such cities as Washington, D.C., New Orleans, New York City, and others. I think you have one coming up in Michigan soon, too? Yeah. Florine has also had solo exhibitions in Paris, Chicago, and at the Savannah College of Art and Design. In recent years, she has lived in Ghana, as well as Tulsa, Oklahoma, and New York. Didier William was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and moved to Miami with his family when he was 6 years old. He received a BFA in painting from the Maryland Institute College of Art and an MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale University School of Art. He, too, has been awarded numerous prestigious grants from the Joan Mitchell, Pew, and Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation, and his work was featured in a major solo show at the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami in 2022 that I was fortunate enough to see. And his work was also very recently featured in Prospect 6 in New Orleans, and a show of his work just opened earlier this month at Altman Siegel Gallery in San Francisco, and it will be up until February 22nd if you happen to be in the area, and I'm looking at you, Terry. Oh, shoot. Didier currently teaches at the Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University, and he lives in Philadelphia. So Florine and Didier, thank you for being here today. Thank you for sharing your work. Thank you for partnering with us on what I think is a really beautiful and timely project. So let's get the slide clicker here. Whoops. So as Seth mentioned, you were both featured in our 2023 exhibition, Multiplicity. And during the run of the show, I actually have installation shots of both of your works from that project. I couldn't help but notice some shared formal elements. We can take a closer look here. Both of you seem to use twinning figures. You feature kind of ambiguously formed bodies. You can't really determine race or gender easily. And then there's that emphasis on the eyes. You, Florine, with the glitter, and Didier, for you, carving a second skin on your forms with the eyeballs. So I'm really delighted, here we are 2 years later, to have the opportunity to talk more about these connections, but also the departures in your practices. So I'm wondering, why don't we begin? If you two would each maybe offer, in your own words, a brief introduction to your practice and some of the connections that maybe you see between each other's work.
I went first yesterday.
Of course it's you. You have to go first.
Thank you, Katie, and always a pleasure to be with you, Florine. And thank you to the Frist for this beautiful hang and conversation between Florine and I. It's been a pleasure to see our work, not just on the walls, but so thoughtfully and generously contextualized, which I think is necessary with all work, but particularly with work of this subject matter. I'm a painter and printmaker, and I begin with that and I emphasize that because I think it has influenced everything I do, even the sort of conceptual strategies that are in my work. I got my MFA in both painting and printmaking, and right from the very beginning, it became very interesting and provocative and fertile to me to think about what collapsing the print matrix and the discrete painting object might look like. What could it mean to take the print matrix, which is intended to produce a multiple, and that historically has always been its function, to take that object and sort of smash it into what we consider to be a discrete singular object painting and create this tertiary thing that we live with and we sort of have to struggle to name and give language to. For me, it made sense to sort of think about that adjacent to or tandem with the ideas around post-coloniality, immigrant narratives, displacement, narratives of home that I was and still am very interested in, and the sort of complex network of symbolism and language that are necessary to really produce that and to slow down the viewer and not promise a kind of transmission of information. That's always been what I found irksome about conventional representation. When I was in art school, I went through the sort of processes of figuring out how to mimetically represent what was on my mind or the narrative that I was trying to think about. And that kind of mimesis, I think, promised the viewer some sort of resolution, some sort of tidy translation of what I was talking about. And the complexity of Black life and the complexity of certainly my own family necessitated that I leverage some of that profound complexity even in the experience that my viewer was having. And so I got out of graduate school and started to think about what it meant to build a body on a substrate, on a canvas, or in my case, on a panel. And I started carving into my wood panels, I think initially out of boredom, I think initially out of frustration. But in so doing, I realized that I wasn't just taking something away from the surface, I was embedding something into the surface at the same time. And there was one piece in particular, which isn't in the show, but lives with a collector in Philadelphia, called His Life Depends on Spotted Eyes. And it was a sort of traditional portrait with a few eyes carved from the top of the head right to about the base of the neck. And that was the first time I carved into any surface, and immediately realized that there was this kind of reciprocity happening between me and the subject in the painting, that there was a kind of circuitry of looking that immediately took place, that there was an intimacy that I didn't get otherwise. And it felt fertile, and it felt like there was much more there than I even knew how to deal with. And so became really convinced and kind of obsessed with carving into the surfaces of my panels, and still am, in the way that it builds this circuitry of looking that I think is required when we're talking about the often eroded, destroyed, diminished narratives of Black and brown people. And in Haiti's history, in our history, so much of the work is not just about representing, but unpacking and filling in those sort of intentional historical gaps that have been left behind and implanted by the international community because it was so important to diminish Haiti's history. So what does it mean for artists like Florine and I to be unpacking that history at the same time as we're trying to be honest and present about the complexities of our own personal lives? For me, that's been the painting project, and it has taken various sort of iterations.
Thank you. You've said it before, the circuitry of looking, and I think that's such an important thing to think about and to understand, and the eyes that are looking at, we're looking at the work and the work is looking back at us. How about you, Florine? Could you tell us more about, introduce yourself and your practice, and what are the eyes that are really coming alive through the glitter? What do they represent for you?
For me, my sort of interest in being an artist or creating art is around materiality. I love materials. I love things that are fuzzy, sticky, weird, and I'm always trying to figure out how to incorporate it in my art practice. The other aspect that sort of inspires me is, biographical narratives as well as immigrant narratives. So for me, most of my inspiration really comes first and foremost from reading and having a different type of understanding of how one views oneself in the world. So I begin with that. And, while I'm throwing things around in the studio in this interest of materials. But most of this work that I've been doing, I would say since around 2010, 2011, really comes from this childhood interest of mine, which is to understand Black people in these different spaces. I grew up in the Caribbean, so I have a well-formed opinion and experience of what it's like to be a Caribbean person. I was also grew up here, and I also have that experience. So there was a big part of me wanting to understand this aspect of ourselves, and that sort of drove me to go to Ghana. I didn't really go because I was necessarily interested to try to figure out what ethnic group my family came from. I was more interested in how we see ourselves. And while in Ghana is where the majority of this type of work began. It allowed me to see my own physical body in a different way. It allowed me to sort of accept aspects of colonialism and how it really sort of twisted our minds and created this type of limitation in how we do things. And generally, I wanted to bring that forth in my artwork. But I didn't want to take the approach where I was sort of instructing the viewer on what to think and how to think, and this is what I want, and this is what I'm trying to say. So I really went about it in a way of going deep into the psyche and looking at the spiritual aspects to ourselves and trying to figure out where did that break apart. And also understanding the traditions of our spiritual practices, coming from the Haitian perspective, as well as the American's perspective and the West African perspective. So for me, the works and the way the figures are positioned, things falling out, hands showing up, it's all about the viewer to be able to connect with that figure. I'm a fan of Impressionism. It's always been like my favorite movement in art. And what I like so much about Impressionism is that slowly but surely, the figures started to look at the viewers. So slowly but surely, you were starting to engage with the figures on the canvas, with the figures on the panels. And so in creating these works, that was one of the first things that I wanted. I didn't want the figures to be sort of in a world that you couldn't connect with. And I felt, for me, that connection with the eyes was key, and it was important that they were looking at you. So you couldn't turn away, you had to sort of face what you were seeing and what you've been engaging with.
It's beautiful. Let's go a little bit further with spirituality. I've learned, working on this project, that there is a tradition of deep spirituality in Haiti, whether that be Catholicism or voodoo, which is a complex hybrid of practice that combines West African, European, and indigenous traditions, but is often very misunderstood. Zora Neale Hurston, interestingly, I also learned, who was, many of you probably know, an anthropologist as well as an author. She spent 6 months in Haiti on a Guggenheim Fellowship studying voodoo. And when she was asked to summarize after her stay there, she said that was like explaining the planetary theory on a postage stamp, impossible to do. And later, when trying to describe its sophistication, she said it's as formal as the Catholic Church is. And I also found it very interesting that she wrote, "Their eyes were watching God in Haiti," which was a fun fact. Florine, could you talk a little bit more about how spirituality manifests in her work? Especially, we have this beautiful shrine that you created just for our installation.
Well, that's been one of the biggest stereotypes about Haitians, is this thing of voodoo, which no one understands, because literally the word voodoo means it's like deity. So it's a complex, I can't even say practice. It's a complex culture, in a way.
An ideology, really. It seems like a worldview, almost.
Completely like a worldview. And oftentimes, the Catholicism comes into it is because of slavery. So, the slaves could not sort of worship in the way that they want. They couldn't do the rituals and the practices in the way that they want. So they substituted these sort of, I forget the word now, these are sort of lithographic prints of saints to sort of replace some of the ideas of voodoo spirits. So it really has nothing to do with Catholicism. And I think that's also been my frustration, is that everyone tries to take West African practices and frame it around European practices of religion, and you really can't. They're like completely different. So for me, my time spent in Ghana was something that, I really was able to delve in deeper to understand how people, view this aspect of spirituality. So, I'll give you like a real brief example. So, for example, if you wanted to, like for me coming to this exhibition, I would consult probably my parents, who would then consult my grandparents if they were still alive, but who would then consult the shrine. And the shrine meaning, my ancestors and whatever family deities that are part of your family. So there's always this sort of belief system that you're not here alone. You have a whole support system around you, seen and unseen. So for you to act alone is incredible. Like, it's egotistical for you to believe that you can just do things on your own and you don't have that support system. So for me, like, I wanted to bring this aspect somehow into my artwork. Because I predominantly work on paper, one of my fears was like, okay, how am I going to incorporate two-dimensional and three-dimensional works together, though they may look dramatically different? Can they come together to create an installation or a project that can sort of bring forth these ideas? And so for me, like, I really wanted to get away from the stereotypes of around West African, cultural practices, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And Didier, spirituality, well, I think of Florine first when it comes to that. It's very much a part, I think, of your work as well, although maybe hidden a little bit more subtle with the symbols in the back of some of the pieces like this. And then, of course, with, let's see if we can find the picture that has the painting and the sculpture. Well, anyway, if the Potomitan?
Yeah. I think for me, spirituality, well, I'll say I always want to make things material in my work. And so the veves that Florine is mentioning, the veves are the symbols that you would draw in chalk on the ground during ceremony, and there's one coordinated with each and every loa. The loas are the gods in Haitian Vodou, and they each have their own veves, intricate sort of symbol that signals that particular deity, that particular loa. And we didn't grow up with Haitian Vodou, but my parents did, and it was one of those things where my brothers and I were always really curious about it, and they always sort of worked tirelessly to keep it from us, which made us even more curious about it, particularly me as an artist who is like, I was the youngest when we moved here, and I wanted to unpack everything about Haiti, and their bodies were my archive to Haiti, and so I wanted to sort of source from them as much as I can many things about Haiti, including Vodou. And so when I think about how spirituality operates in the work, for me it was material. It lived in the blankets and fabrics that my mom and dad brought from Haiti. It lived in the food that we ate. It lived in the images on the walls. It lived in the clothing that I saw them wear. One of my most vivid memories is when we first moved to Miami and my dad took me to a ceremony in Little Haiti. I think I was about 7, and it's one of the most vivid memories that I can sort of recall. And the thing that sticks out the most is the white dresses, the white gowns that everybody was wearing. And as a kid, everyone felt like they were 20 feet tall. And so the materiality that spirituality can connote, for me, always becomes painting ephemera. So when you see it show up in my work, it'll be architecture, it'll be walls, it'll be sculpture like the one that is on the screen right now, the Potomitan. In Vodou, the Potomitan is the passageway to access the loas. It's the sort of throughway that we have access to the gods. Although in traditional Vodou, the Potomitan would not be made of bodies. It would be made of worship objects, will be made of important objects to the family, sometimes will be made of actual wood. in this case, I wanted it to be made of a stack or a column of bodies. In particular, I was thinking about how, again, as I was referring to earlier, for a lot of immigrant families, the body is the archive. You don't necessarily have the privilege of moving to the United States with all of the material ephemera and comforts that you had at home. My parents sold everything, raised $7,000, and took their 3 small kids and moved to another country with a new language and a new neighbors and new city to sort of acclimate to. And our archive to this home that we left behind was their literal bodies. And so I wanted the body to serve as that archive in the Potomita that was shown in that Mocha show. So again, for me, I always wanted to come back to this idea of materiality.
Yeah. And that form is also represented in the painting.
Yeah.
And for those of you who've seen the exhibition and are close lookers, that sculpture, we had a little shipping snafu, but it will be here next week, so just stay tuned. Please come back for that. So I've also learned that Haiti has a very rich storytelling and folklore tradition, cric-crac. And I have to say that when I look at your works, Didier, a piece like this, or Florine, Matacong, and Magic, I mean, you can't help but to start wondering what the story is behind these paintings. Do you feel like that tradition has influenced you? Are you telling stories as well?
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. Anyone who knows me more than 5 minutes, I have a story for them. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very much part of being Haitian, with our proverbial sayings. It even, for me to say I came to the museum, I'm just like, oh yeah, I jump into an Uber to came to the museum. There's a whole narrative that goes with it. I think that's just inherent in Black culture in general, but particularly Haiti, we have a whole, almost a whole system of telling stories, and when you say it, how you say it. And also it's like, to me, what I've missed is the gathering around of people in storytellings and how the stories change every time they're told, you know? So that I always want to bring forth into my work, because then those narratives grow and have their own life outside of me or outside of the person who's telling the story to me.
Mm-hmm. Could you share, I'm trying to again see, like, are there any specific stories that you feel? I should note too that Florine made all new work for our exhibition, which was pretty exciting. Was there anything in particular that you were thinking about story-wise? Like
these stories, like, you know, I in my mind I said, oh yeah, the swimmers with these little swimming figures. There are always these stories, for Caribbean folks, mothers in particular, love to control their children. And Haitian mothers would control you through the "m'te rêvé," which means I had a dream. The minute you hear that, you know whatever you had planned in life has now come to a full stop. So if you were going to a party, if you were going to travel, they had a dream. Something happened. And so that's something that really influenced my life a lot until I got bold enough to tell my mother, you know what, it's your dream. It's not for me. Oh. You're dreaming for you. You're dreaming for me. But in this piece, when I was making it, I was thinking about how they always tell you these stories of water deities, of how like a fisherman goes out and he's fishing at night and there's this spirit or a mermaid that comes up and there's sort of connection between that. So there's always been this sort of inherent, I wouldn't say fear, but awareness of spirits, creatures, all sorts of other beings that we need to really pay attention to. So in creating these pieces, I incorporated this sort of swimmer piece. I was working at it with it also in the SCAD show, and it just for me like a reminder of not only like these water creatures, but also the ancestors that live in these realms that we don't necessarily see or always engage with, but they are present and they are there.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. So your stories, I think, are a little bit more spiritual and mythical, whereas Didier, it seems like some of the stories you're telling are more based on like your personal narrative. This painting in particular, but could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I love narrative as well, but I also never want to let the viewer off the hook. You know, narrative is eroded by time, is eroded by memory, is eroded by positionality, and all of these things that kind of complicate how we experience a narrative, I affirm should also be part of experiencing the object. And for me, that comes back to what's happening on the surface. And so there's always sort of separations and bifurcations that interrupt the sort of tidiness of that narrative. The painting that Katie is referring to, Redemption, Resurrection, was one that was about something that happened to my brother in the early 90s when a lot of Haitians were facing persecution, particularly Haitian children, were facing persecution, and my brother was in school at the time, and he came home and had gotten roughed up, and our oldest brother ran out to avenge him. And this story was told to me as a grown-up, as a 40-year-old man, and I was trying to sort of recount what that 10-year-old kid witnessed when his two brothers were in this state of trauma, the sort of epic grandeur of it, the exaggeration of the story, the vulnerability of the story, the fear, embedded fear that I'm sure gripped everyone. And all of that comes together for me to inform the narrative. So the narrative isn't just a sort of sequential, tidy reassembly of facts. The narrative is a complex network of things that don't necessarily resolve and for whom catharsis isn't always the goal.
And I think you've both talked about the viewer brings their own, if it's not a clear, tidy story, there's your own interpretation that kind of muddies it or could muddy it as well. So while we were, or at least I was very much aware that this exhibition would be shown opposite at the same time as Farm to Table, this exhibition of late 19th century French art. And we knew that it was, conceptually that it would offer an opportunity to talk about colonialism. I think you both had individual moments where you were like, wow, this is really, powerful, and it felt very palpable walking through that show, especially seeing things like sugar on the tables, just what those connections really are. I'm wondering, what would you like to say? Do you have anything that you'd like to say about that, the position of this show in relationship to that one, and really the legacy, the larger question, the legacy of French colonialism on Haiti, both right in the aftermath of the revolution in 1804, and now?
That's a lot, Katie.
I know.
That's a lot.
Maybe we should have started with that one.
Simple question, right?
Right.
I think it's a wonderful show that's juxtaposed next to our show. And to look at something like sugar, because that is something that's rarely discussed in European history. Like when I learned art history, no one would really talk about where all of these objects came from, even down to the cloth, where that came from, and how Europe benefited, evolved, enriched itself through the labor of Black people in the colonies. So to me, it's like, go look at that show in a very different way. Think about it. And then go tap on that Haitian timeline and go back in and then start to ask yourself some questions.
Yeah, I think it's kudos to the Frist for that pairing. I think it's the kind of work that museums and that art history should be doing. That the adjacency of our two exhibitions, I think, is really, really critical. It's no accident that even you, Katie, mentioned you learned so much about Haitian history just from doing the research for our show after the revolution to mention the word Haiti was illegal in the colonies. It's no accident that the majority of our audience probably doesn't know much about Haitian history. It's intentional that the international community, namely France, the United States, and Canada, follow Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. They want that superlative to replace Haiti's actual history as the most abused, the most diminished, the most ravaged country in the Western Hemisphere by those three international powers. And it's interesting to see a show like Farm to Table where we sort of walk through this version of France and then see what was happening almost at the exact same time in one of France's colonies, producing the ephemera that we see painted on the front of the gallery. So I was just like bowled over at the thoughtfulness and the ambition and also the bravery of the exhibition. I think it should be a model for museums that are trying to present this work in its truest fashion with all of its violence intact.
And I think, too, when you're talking about the narrative that people want to associate with Haiti, there is also just trying to erase the fact that they were the only folks that were able, aside from the US, that were able to overthrow their colonizers in that way and were able to establish the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. That just kind of gets overlooked intentionally. Didier, this pair, and there's a third work in this series, does not pull any punches. Would you, especially in relation to this subject, would you like to maybe tell us what the title means and what you're saying here?
Yeah, Coupé Tête Boulé Caille is believed to have been one of the rallying cries by Dessalines in the revolutionaries in 1804. And the Veve in the background is Papa Legba, who is one of the guardians between this life and the next. So that's the pattern that you see printed in the background of the painting. And around this time, and still, I've started to lean into this idea that my figures are these sort of titans, these superhuman characters. It's never been interesting to me to think of them as human. Black folks worldwide, not just in Haiti, were never part of the Human Project, and so I didn't want the ecosystem that I was building in my studio to have humanity as an aspirational condition for my characters. I wanted them to be something larger than human. I think Zoe Samudzi, in one of her essays from my show, like 4 years ago, called them titans, and I really love that. And I had started to think about them as these titans and these characters that were emanating lightning bolts from their fingertips and destroying their captors and murdering their captors, murdering their enslavers. And so I made a painting, triptych. This is 2 of the triptych, with the dead bodies of their enslavers at the base of the painting, entitled it Coupé Tête Boulé Caille.
I'm just realizing there's another formal connection. Sometimes, Florine, you have bands of, I don't know what you would call it, almost seems like magic spiderweb material coming from your figure's hands that have always seemed like an empowering kind of supernatural force.
Yeah, it was a way for me to show like some sort of power ray.
Yes.
Or some sort of way of communicating. I think very, very
I just realized we were both thinking of
yeah, it's a way of communicating. And I think it's also secretly like my love of comic books and like this superhero theme that just forever evolving, this idea that we can be so much more than what we believe we are. And also like a way of like communication. I think it's something that human beings understand on the very basic level. Like we could all understand that. And so it's also finding that sort of mark making way of communicating that on the very basic level, it will impart something to them without maybe understanding the rest of the history or the context of the work.
Can I also say, Florine's reminding me that, one of the things I grew up with was X-Men and G.I. Joe. And in the 80s and early 90s, those cartoons were incredibly political.
Exactly.
I mean, if you go back and rewatch old G.I. Joes, they're talking about things that children have no idea. You have to sort of see those cartoons in from the lens of an adult who's aware of social politics. And that sort of supernatural element, I think, still pervades both of our practices when we think about what the body is doing and what the body can do, particularly when we think about our ancestors and what they did. One of the reasons the Haitian Revolution was successful because it's unimaginable. It was unimaginable that these group of stolen West Africans could not only overthrow three of the world's strongest nations at the time, but even conceive of themselves as able to do so. That level of cognition and self-awareness wasn't afforded to them. And so what kind of extent of supernatural capacity had to be imagined in order to do so?
And I also think too, like the aspects of voodoo, when you go to certain voodoo ceremonies, especially with somebody like Dambala, when particular spirits that come that are fiery spirits, and you see people do like incredible things like eat glass, walk through coals. So this hot coals. I mean, you say coals, but hot burning coals. So to see certain things like that, very young, you realize, okay, there's aspects of me that I can access to do these things.
And even before we had language for queerness and non-binary bodies, that sort of slippage beyond the singular was already in Haitian Vodou. The sort of atemporal capacity of a body to move through time was already in Haitian Vodou. The liberatory capacity for blackness and black personhood was already in some of these practices that are considered sort of primitive or third world. And I think, speaking for myself, but also perhaps for Florine, when we sort of embed these motifs that kind of go to the supernatural, that part of the history is what we're calling forth.
Yeah, and I think our talk yesterday, we were talking about masculinity and femininity. In sort of the voodoo's perspective, it's both. You can be a Wungan, a voodoo priest or a priestess, and you embody the spirit or a female spirit or a male spirit, and you completely become that spirit. So there's a way within our culture where you straddle both. You really experience both, genders.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really profound. It's a lot to think about. Thank you. So before we turn things over to the crowd and see if they have, or our audience, to see if they have any questions, I'd like to throw out another big question. 2 years ago, when we began thinking about this exhibition, I was interested in doing the show because I loved your work and I really wanted to see more and learn more. And I definitely was aware that this could be an opportunity for our viewers, people like me who know very little about this place and people aside from what's in the headlines, and as we've talked about, that often is some form of trauma or tragedy, whether it's an earthquake or gang violence. And sadly, of course, since that time, Haitian immigrants have become the target of very hateful and ignorant political rhetoric. And as of last week, the humanitarian parole program that was for Haitians as well as Cubans, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans, which was for folks from those countries seeking a safer life here in the United States, that program's been revoked. So to me, this exhibition feels even more urgent, not only for us to learn more about your experiences in your art, but to try to maybe see how that applies to the experiences and the more complete, the more full humanity of all immigrants and their families. And I guess a question would be, is that too much of a heavy lift? Is that seeing too much? Or do you feel like your personal experiences, that there is intersection with that of immigrants from all over?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't think the Haitian experience is in its own little silo, its own little bubble. But for me in particular, it's the the sort of venom that comes out of it, that's always questionable. And I think it does come from the fact that we liberated ourselves from France. So there's been, what I used to say when I was in college, this long-standing punishment of Haiti for that. Because people forget, it's an island that's divided, and the other part is Dominican Republic, and Haitians are there too. So I always say, like, why do they talk about Haiti like it's its own little thing someplace else, where literally it's an island and the people traverse back and forth? So why don't Dominicans face that? You understand? This is something very specific, very particular with Haitians, and it's Haiti's long history with America that most Americans do not know. So that's the other aspect. We're not taught that in school. We just taught about, okay, there was this revolt, and they're the poorest country, and they practice voodoo, and that's as far as it goes. So part of it's really Americans learning our history, our connections with other countries, and how our policies affect other countries, and vice versa. So, I mean, can this show do that? Perhaps. I think looking at these works, these sort of historical French pieces, and then coming into the space where, I've erected a shrine, Didier has a potomita, it will challenge you. It will ask you to really start to make these different kind of connections. And I think that's what's more important right now.
I'm not sure. I mean, I sometimes resist trying to prescribe what artwork is going to do, because once the work leaves the studio, I have no control. It's yours. You decide what to do with it. I can affect it, I can manipulate it, I can follow a sequence and methods and traditions of making that have some kind of cultural meaning, but once the work leaves the studio, to quote Toni Morrison, I'm putting it in your hands. And I need to do the work of making sure that my research is rigorous and making sure that my intentions are honest, but now it's in your hands to figure out what to do with it. All I can do is be honest about what I'm talking about. And that has worked. I'm a gay Black immigrant, and that story will always be the first line of anything I do. And if that story is at odds with what I'm supposed to be or how I'm supposed to function in the world, that's not my responsibility. That's the responsibility of institutions to figure out how to reconcile that. My responsibility is to make the work.
Well, I think that's a challenge then for all of us as viewers, and I hope it's a start. We have a few moments for questions. If any of our audience members have something they'd like to ask either of our artists.
We don't bite.
Hello, thank y'all for this talk. I was interested in talking about y'all's perspectives on like being a part of diaspora, being an immigrant, and those things. I was wondering, one, where does like grief exist in your work?
Did you say grief?
Grief, and also if you don't want to share where grief exists in your work, because another question I had is what sort of things do you keep for yourself when it comes to making work that unpacks these lineages, these, buried truths that everybody really don't need to know all the time. So what do you keep for yourself, and where does grief exist in your work?
What a brilliant question. Amazing question. I love that question.
She's family.
Yeah. Where does grief exist in the work? Everywhere. Everywhere. The first thing that comes to mind is that painting that I mentioned earlier about my brother. And one of the things that's most difficult about that painting is that I had to sort of relearn the trauma that he went through, which the painting fails at, right? The painting is a failure at communicating to me or to you what my brother actually went through. And in some ways, that's the space that I'm interested in painting occupying, because I know that painting is always going to fail when it comes to representing that grief. Painting is always going to fail when it comes to representing that mourning, but it can do other things. It can provoke other engagements that can be just as intense and just as gratifying. And so the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is like, it's everywhere in the work, especially in the kind of work that I think Florine and I are doing. And in terms of what I keep for myself, I can think about specific paintings that sometimes when they happen, I don't give them to the gallery. Sorry, Becky. Because they're too personal or because they struck a chord. And oftentimes it's paintings that are deeply personal, paintings that are autobiographical about my parents or about my brothers. In my case, as Katie mentioned, whenever I'm working with narrative, it's almost always a family story because I was so young when we moved here. And for me, the paintings become a process of excavation. And sometimes I may not necessarily be ready for what I find. And I have to contend with that, right? I have to then figure out, am I ready for you all to consume that, or do I want to keep it hidden away? There's one painting that's a little 12 by 12 inch painting that I made in 2012. I've never shown it. And it's at our house, and I will never show it. I love that question, thank you.
For me, my work, I think, became, I wouldn't say better, but more open when I was willing to be vulnerable. I'm a person I could easily be detached. So I can make the work, it doesn't have to be about me, it doesn't have to be about topics that are necessarily hit on the emotional chord. But once I decided to, okay, you know, people gonna know a little bit about Florine and be vulnerable, it completely changed the way that I work. I think one of the pieces that was the most difficult piece is a two-part piece. It was called The Weight of Rejection. There was this, you know, trying to reconcile within myself, like, why do you feel rejected? And how could I, like, show this in an artwork? And am I willing to even show it publicly and have to talk about it? That was a huge move for me to be able to do that. It's very much cultural. You know, I was brought up that you really don't talk about your private business. What's in the home is in the home. You don't bring it into the public sphere. So it's very hard when you are in the public sphere, when your work is out living in the world, to be able to sort of share a part of yourself, but not too much. The second part, to answer your question, would also be about like my physical body. When I first began working with myself in completely nude, and I thought, oh my God, one day my parents are gonna look at this. They're gonna know. And they're gonna ask me those Haitian questions like, why? Pourquoi? Why? Why are you doing this nude? You can just cover up, you know? So these are all of the things that sort of went through my head in terms of creating these types, you know, of works that I do now, that like now I'm comfortable having the piece in my parents' living room and they're looking at it every day and they're like okay with it. So it's a real process to show grief. And I would think also the third part is there's so much narrative around grief and the Black woman. You know, there's very little narratives about Black women in celebration. It's always about grief. It's always about strife. It's always about something negative, something that weighs us down and pulls us down. And I also wanted to be aware of that. I wanted to bring something else into what I'm doing, that it's not always about that aspect of our lives.
Thank you so much. I had a question.
Of course, thank you. The talk is about body and the presence of body in your work. I'm very interested to know about the labor in the production of the artwork, your body as the body of artist who creates. How this physical engagement with the work you see influences your concept, but also the production of the work. And you can answer it however that you see that labor in that production. I hope it's clear.
Yeah. For me, the labor is excruciating in terms of physically making the work, having the time, the lifting, the loading, the bending over, the bad, at times, bad lighting, the straining, the tears that I have to blot out because it can be so emotional. I think that's a very good question because that's not always inherent when you see the finished product, right? You don't necessarily understand or the sort of process and the actual physicality in the work, the physical work that the artist put into creating the work. I also think too, it's also cultural. I mean, that's part of Haitian culture. We work. When we have sayings, dégagez, make your way, figure it out. So there's also this part of me where I have to always tell myself like, okay, you need to stop. Because as part of our culture, we value work so much. So for me to overwork is nothing. You understand what I'm saying? So there's a part of me in creating the work, I already know I'm going to overwork. I know I'm going to be tired. I know I'm going to be exhausted. I know I'm going to cry. I know I'm going to have a fit. And then it'll all be done. It'll be fine.
I feel like my physical therapist could better answer this question than I could. And I think I'm more aware of the labor that it costs now having 2 toddlers and having to do the exact same thing that I just did at the studio for 7 hours now at home, but with little people that don't sit still. And as Florine said, being hyper aware of the cost on my body, which to Florine's point again, I also enjoy, right? Because we're engaged in imaging and bringing forth these bodies that don't exist, having these conversations about personhood, in some cases our own, and you feel it. You feel it in your lower back, you feel it in your shoulders. I often work horizontally, and so particularly on the big paintings, I'm leaning over the painting at a skew for like 5 hours, making these small sort of hatch marks in paint. If you see the paintings over in the gallery, a lot of my paint application is by stippling, and so I'm layering different colors of painting on top of one another, and I'm sort of slashing the surface repeatedly over and over again. But if I'm working in the center of the panel, I'm having to sort of stretch and lean over that panel, and pretty soon that lower back is like, you need to cut this out. But it's satisfying, it's exciting, it's engaging, it's the kind of physical work that my body is familiar with. My dad was a mechanic and my mom is a chef, so when we came to this country, the parents I grew up with were parents who were producing things with their bodies and never complained about it, never lamented it, took great pride in it. And for them, there was a sort of alchemy to it that I carried with me to the painting studio. So that labor is not separate from how we're thinking about how the body operates on the pictorial plane.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here, Didier and Florine. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
For everything. I hope you go back and enjoy the show more than once, and please take advantage of some of the other programming opportunities that we'll have here at the Frist that are happening at Vanderbilt, and hope to see you in the gallery soon.